The Snow Woman. Once upon a time, in a mountainous village, there lived two woodcutters. He was kind and affable, but he had grown old, so he was teaching his young friend of his trade tricks. Each day both the men walked into the forest together, and after a long day's work, together they traveled home. One night they had just reached the river where they usually crossed by ferry boat, when a snowstorm struck. Wind howled, pellets of snow felt like bullets stinging their faces. Soon they were surrounded by snow banks, and the moon shone bright white against the river and mountains. The sharp wind cut through their clothing, and to their dismay, the ferryboat man had gone away. His boat was on the far side of the river. The shivering men looked around and saw the ferryman's hut. It was tiny, with no brazier, but when they pulled the door shut tightly behind them, they sighed a relief. They huddled close, wrapping their straw coat around them. The young man lay awake listening to the roar of the wind and the snow pelting against the door. After a long while, his eyes began to feel heavy, but suddenly, the door burst open and snow swirled into the hut. There, standing in the bright moonlight that streamed in, stood a tall, beautiful woman, pale as snow, her long hair cascading around her, her eyes dark as the winter sky. She swept into the room, and she leaned over the old man and began to breathe cold breath over him. Terrified by the sight, realized this must be the Snow Woman. The young man had heard tales of the ghost woman who appeared in winter storms, and turned people to frozen corpses with one blast of cold breath. He tried to cry out for help, help, but his words were frozen. She then turned and leaned over him, and she was just about to blow up her chilling wind on him, when she suddenly smiled. "I was going to freeze you," she said, "but you are so young and handsome. Promise me you will never tell anyone what you have seen tonight, and I will spare you. If you ever break your words of honor, you will suffer a terrible fate of fear." The young man nodded, and he whispered, "I promise you, I will not disclose or discuss with anyone about tonight's incident." And as quickly as she had appeared, the Snow Woman just disappeared without a sound through the doorway and vanished, leaving no footprints behind. The young man got up and closed the door and once again lay down. "I must have been dreaming," he said, and he called out, "My old master, speak to me." But when his friend did not answer, he reached out in the dark and touched his face. To his horror, he discovered the poor old man had turned to ice. At dawn the ferryman returned and found the two men lying in a frozen heap. The old man was dead, but the ferryman wrapped up the young man in warm blankets and hurried him to the village for help. The young man recovered, but for a long time, each time he closed his eyes to sleep, he saw visions of that ghostly Snow Woman, and the death of his old master haunted him. Time passed, and the memory faded, and sometimes he wondered if she had been only a dream. Then one day he was returning from a long day's work when he happened upon a pretty young girl walking alone, along the same path. He greeted her, and they began to walk and talk of their lives. He told her of his little hut and his beloved mother. The girl smiled. "I am all alone in the world," she told him. "I have no family. The young man was charmed by the girl, and she was equally charmed by him, and by the time they had reached the village, they were in love and they understood they would get married. The girl was a fine wife, and together they had 10 children and lived happily for many long years. Everyone in the village loved the young man's bold wife for beauty and behavior. But as the years passed, people began to notice that the young man's wife did not age. They marveled at this, for 20 years had passed, and still she looked as young as the day she and her husband had met. One night, when the children were asleep, she and her husband sat beside the fire. The young man was admiring his wife's beauty, when suddenly he said, "You know, sometimes you remind me of a woman I once saw in a snowstormy night, or a woman I dreamed, I am not sure." His wife looked up, her eyes flashing. "Who do you mean?" she asked, and her husband was surprised to hear her voice suddenly sounding harsh. He told her the tale of the night in the ferryman's hut. "I was afraid of that snow woman," he confessed. "I think she must have been the snow ghost people talk of." His wife stood up, and her eyes turned darker still, and she no longer looked like his beloved, beautiful wife. She looked terrifying, and when she opened her mouth to speak, her voice sounded like screaming wind. "Yes, you saw me. Indeed, you did saw the snow woman, but you had promised that you would never disclose to a soul, and now you shall suffer because you have broken your promise." Her husband stared at her. "Please forgive me," he begged, and once again he felt as if he were the young man shivering alone in that swaying hut all those years ago. "If it weren't for our children," she shrieked, "I would have killed you, but you are a great husband and a good father." Then, before his eyes, the snow woman turned into a pale plume of mist and sailed toward the door, drifting out through the cracks. The young man never saw her again, but whenever the wind howled and the snow fell, he was certain and could feel the presence of his beloved snow woman. If you like the story, please do like, share and subscribe. Thank you for listening.